Hello, everybody. I'm back with the second talk on research basics for the developing countries. Today, the topic is three important features of science, and I'm going to give historical examples for them as well. Now, before I proceed, for those friends who are watching these videos and have joined the Facebook group, thank you. And I also encourage you to invite other friends and colleagues as well. Now, to start, what you see here will appear very normal and natural to you. We all know that we wash hands, doctors wash hands, everybody washes hands now with the soap. We know that the surgeons have to use very clean, sanitized environment for surgical procedures. Even laymen know that they need to use soap to wash their hands, and many people use antiseptics as well. But you might be surprised to know that this is relatively new. Just about 200 years ago, this was not happening. People didn't know to wash their hands. Even doctors did not know that they needed to wash their hands before procedures. So here I'm going to talk about the very famous hand washing studies. And these are studies by Dr. Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian doctor who worked in a hospital, inpatient hospital, and the hand washing was not a standard practice at the time. So some of this data is before him, but he collected that data as well, and then the real concern arose somewhere in the 1830s, but between 1784 and 1822, the topmost column, the maternal deaths. This was a unit where deliveries were happening. So the maternal deaths out of 1,000 live births were 12. And that's not a bad number for that period of time. In fact, it's a good number. But at that time, no post-mortem studies were happening in that hospital. After 1833, routine post-mortem examination started in that hospital. And maternal deaths rose to 53 per 1,000 live births. So there was a four-fold increase in it. Between 1833 and 1838, they divided the hospital into two units. And in one unit, both units had doctors as well as midwives. And the maternal death rate was still high, above 50 into 60s per 1,000 live births. So that's around the time when Semmelweis started thinking about, or in fact, he started thinking, about that time. And around that time also, the clinics got divided into one clinic for midwives and one clinic for doctors. And in the clinic that was run by doctors, maternal mortality went from about 60 per 1,000 to 90 per 1,000. Whereas in the clinic run by midwives, it was around 33 per 1,000 live births. And there was some chatter even before these studies that hand washing should be practiced, but doctors were not practicing it because they thought they didn't think there was a need for it. There was no evidence that it helped. So this is how much undeveloped medical science was just 200 years ago. So Dr. Semmelweis did a few studies. Like one of his studies was to do something with the air, because they knew that things were transmitted via air. They knew from smallpox that contagion can happen. So he tried to change some air conditions of the clinic. It didn't change a thing. His second theory was that because the priest who was coming to see the dying patients had to ring a bell that rang in the medical clinic, and he said probably that created fear among the patients, and that was increasing the death rate. And he changed that setup, but that also didn't change. And then he realized that, in fact, he realized because one of his colleagues had caught an infection after an accidental scalpel cut on his finger while he was doing an autopsy, and he died. I think he died, and that then made Dr. Semmelweis think that probably there was something being transmitted from the corpses that they were doing postmortem on to the woman who had given birth to the babies or were giving birth to the babies, and that's why the death rate was high. So he started coming up with the hand washing theory, and ultimately this hand washing theory did catch some ground, and the science was able to say that yes, hand washing is needed because something gets transmitted, and there were no tools to study the germs. Nobody knew about germs. Nobody was studying them under the microscope. So that explains that when we don't have the tools, or if we are not using the right tools, how long it can take for something to develop. But if we do have the tools and we use them in the right way to do the studies, that study can make a huge impact. Now, developing on the tools and the germs, again, you see here things that you are very familiar with. You see a microscope. Now even kids in schools know that. They do some funny stuff with them, experiments and some watch things under it. We know about the germs. We know about the pasteurized milk and all that stuff. We know pasteurization helps increase the shelf life of milk. But again, this is just over less than 150 years old. And after the germs theory got introduced, this was the time that happened. And would you believe that just about 200 years ago, or just over 200 years ago, researchers were struggling with spontaneous generation, meaning that life form can happen from non-life form, like the famous Aristotelian era theories about that if you leave old clothes and grain at some spot for a number of months, it creates mice. So those sort of theories were still prevalent among science and medical science even like 200-300 years ago. So John Needham, and he was a British, and an Italian, Lazzaro Spallanzani, they were fighting with each other through their experiments. They were debating, arguing. They couldn't figure out. They were boiling the broth, which like a meat broth, and if they left it open in the air, it will become clouded, and in fact, the germs will grow in it. But if they boiled it well and they covered it tightly, then the germs will not grow. But the catch was that there was also theory at the time that the life vital force that can make things grow from just simple organic material was transmitted via air. So if you closed the jar with the broth in it tightly, air was not going in, so the vital force was not going in. So in the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur, who came up with this very interesting design. So he developed these flasks where their necks were prolonged and curved. They were very prolonged and curved, so everybody agreed that the air was still going in, but because they were curved, it was not really air flowing in like it would flow in an open jar, and so organisms were not getting produced in the broth. So his experiments, and he did a series of them, and he repeated them, and as I mentioned in the first talk, the science has to show that the experiment can be done again and again and again. So he showed them a series of experiments that this was right. There was no fluke in it. It was right. And that's how we figured out that it was basically germs going in, and germs were producing germs, and germs were the thing that were making milk go bad. And because Louis Pasteur had studied that, had shown that if you boil liquids for so long, or broth for so long, germs in it die. Now we know they don't die completely, but they get almost gone, almost all of them gone. So they can't grow back quickly. So the shelf life of the product increases. So my point here is again about the methodology. So he developed a unique methodology. And it seems very simple, but it was very unique. It was a turning point in science. Now to highlight the third important point, that science evolves and develops over time. Here I would like to mention the Amine hypothesis of depression, a very famous hypothesis. It was introduced and promoted in the 1950s. And the hypothesis basically was a reverse hypothesis in the sense that at the time medications were developed that had dopaminergic, adrenergic, and serotonergic properties, and they were effective to treat depression. So nobody really knew how the drugs were working because there were nobody had electronic microscope and in vitro studies and all those type of studies that we can do now. But they knew these drugs were working and they had these properties, so they proposed this hypothesis. And this hypothesis is still debated. After 70 years, it still is debated. But over the course of time, we now know that it's not only dopamine, adrenaline, and serotonin. These three major compounds have tens of types of receptors and subtypes of receptors. They have unique functions in the brain. We also know that in addition to these three major amines, there are other neurochemicals, there are other tens of neurochemicals and neurohormones that are involved in regulation of emotions and in emotional difficulties and mental health issues. So all that took 70 years with all the new technology and all the new methodologies. So science takes time to evolve. Now to sum it all up, science works when we develop theories, we develop tools and methodologies to study those, to critically assess those theories. We repeat the process, we get new methodologies, we get new tools, we repeat them again, and after a period of time, we end up with new theories. The problem with the developing world is that it has been left behind due to number of international as well as national issues of those countries. So what is happening over there is basically a lot of replicative research. They're trying to just chase what the developed countries have already done 10, 20, 30 years ago. New ideas, new methodologies, new studies, new tools, they are not happening. That's why it's extremely rare for me to come across in my specialty, and I at one time I was subscribing to over 10 leading journals of medical sciences. Extreme rare to come across any studies from developing countries in those journals, because those journals will publish very high quality latest developments in the field. It is very important for those countries to really put their minds together and figure out how to catch up. An important method to catch up is to become familiar with the latest scientific literature that is credible, that is top quality, and that is published in the prestigious, well-known journals. And then learn things from it, learn how those things are being done, and then you can develop your own methodologies and your own systems to do it. My small effort is in that direction. And if you are watching this video and you find it helpful or you find it meaningful, please share with other colleagues so that the message gets out and this educational effort spreads. Thank you very much. Bye.